One of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. He went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Jesus answered him, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss. But this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet." Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace."
A man was driving home from work one day when he saw a group of young children out selling lemonade on a corner near his home, and most of us have seen this kind of sight. They had written on the little sign, lemonade, 50 cents. It was a hot day, kind of like it is often here in Southwest Florida, and so he was thirsty, and he was also impressed with the enterprising young children. So he pulled over to the curb to buy a cup of lemonade and to give his support to the children's financial cause. A young boy approached his car, and the man placed his order for 1 cup of lemonade, and he gave the boy $1. And the boy went back to the other kids, and they opened up their little cigar box where they had their change, and they carefully tried to figure out exactly how much they owed him, and they picked up 2 quarters and took it back to him with a cup of lemonade and handed it to him. And then the boy just stood there beside his car while he was drinking at the lemonade. Just stared at him the whole time he was drinking his lemonade. Finally, the boy asked the man if he was finished, and he said, "Well, just about, but why?" And he said, "That's the only cup we have, and we have to have it back. We have to have it back in order to stay in business." It's pretty difficult to start a lemonade stand business if you only got 1 cup, isn't it? You know what? That's something of a parable for what Jesus saw in the religious leaders of his day. The Pharisees only had 1 cup. They only had 1 cup of love to offer, and that's if you did everything exactly the way they thought you should do it, everything exactly the way they interpreted Scripture, They taught people that it was important to love, but it was a very restricted, limited, narrow, conditional love that they lived out themselves and that they called for and enforced among their followers. Love those who look like you. Love those who dress like you. Love those who talk like you. Even love those who eat exactly like you. And definitely love only those who think just like you. And shun everybody else. In other words, love only those that we have accepted into our little inner circle and see everybody else as the enemy. See everybody else as the adversary. See everybody else as the opponent, the outcast. When it came to love, that was the only cup they had. And so they kept collecting it back from the people over and over and over again. They didn't know what else to do. And then along came Jesus with a different approach, a different mindset, a different way to think. He loved everybody. He accepted everybody. He included everybody. He reached out generously and intentionally to those who were outcast, to those who were unloved, to those who were down and out on their luck. And he said to them, if you only love those who look like you and act like you and talk like you, what makes you different from the Pharisees? What makes you even different from the pagans and the unbelievers? He reached out graciously and intentionally to those who were hurting, to those who were poor, to those who were needy, to those who were in trouble, to those who were sick, to those who were afflicted, to those who were labeled by society as outcasts, even to lepers, even to sinful women. And he drew them into his circle of love. And when it came to love, he had more than one cup. He had plenty of cups to share. And then he said to his followers, look now, this is the way I want you to live in love. I want you to live and love the way I am living and loving others. Love one another as I have loved you. Take up this torch of Christ-like love. That was so important to Jesus. But the truth is, at first, even those closest to him, the disciples, didn't get it. Even the disciples continued to push outcasts away from him. Even the disciples continued continually to push little children away from him. Even disciples continued to try to protect him from God knows what. Even they had adopted much of the Pharisees' belief of, we only have one cup approach to love that they had been taught all their lives. And then here comes Jesus saying, no, don't do that anymore. That's not the way to live. That's not the way to love. And that's precisely what this story that we just watched word for word from Scripture in Luke chapter 7 is all about. Remember it with me. A Pharisee invites Jesus to his home as the guest of honor for a banquet, but strangely, the Pharisee does not treat Jesus as you would normally treat a guest of honor. Normally, 3 courtesies were extended to a respected guest. First, the host would give his guest the kiss of peace. Second, cool water would be poured over his guest's feet to cleanse and to comfort him. And third, a guest's head was anointed with a punch of sweet-smelling incense or perfume from rose petals. But according to what Jesus said in this text, when he arrived in the Pharisee Simon's home, none of these things were done for him. Why? They were such a common practice of the day. Why were they not done? Well, we're not told. We have to speculate. I suppose that it's possible that the Pharisee has a hidden agenda here. Maybe he has, as so many other Pharisees had on many occasions, invited Jesus there to try to trip him up or to try to trap him with some sort of loaded question over dinner. Maybe he doesn't want to appear too friendly with this itinerant preacher from Nazareth in front of his friends. Maybe he's worried how his friends will think about him accepting this guy that they're all talking about and is all in the news of the land. Or maybe the Pharisee is afraid of guilt by association because he knows Jesus has been out on the streets associating with sinners and tax collectors and all sorts of people that Pharisees would never associate with, the outcast of the world, and he doesn't want to feel guilty by association. Whatever the case, Simon the Pharisee does not perform these three common acts of good manners and respect. In those days, houses of well-to-do people were built around an open courtyard in the form of a hollow square. And those of you who've been to the Holy Land have seen that kind of thing. And often there in the courtyard was where the banquets took place, and people passing by on the streets could look in. And sometimes they could just walk up and observe from the outside, so they could listen to the lessons given by the Pharisees and the rabbis as they ate together. Jesus himself often gave some lessons in those very same settings. And so that's what's happening in our text when suddenly a woman from the street who was uninvited, suddenly a woman who, how shall I put this, had a bit of a reputation around town, walked in from the crowded street and was listening and watching. And she noticed that the good manners had not been expressed to Jesus. So she rises to the occasion. First, the text says she washes Jesus' feet with her tears. Second, she dries his feet with her hair. And third, she anoints his feet with perfume. The very things that were supposed to have been done by the host, Simon the Pharisee. She comes in and does. The outcast is the one doing the good deed. Now, the Pharisee, Simon, as we saw in the video text, was highly offended. Who does this woman think she is? And not only who does this woman think she is, who does Jesus think he is, letting this common woman from the streets come in and touch him? No Pharisee would have let her, in her condition, with her reputation, come in and touch him. Jesus sees it as a beautiful, tender, thoughtful, loving gesture. And he commends her, and he includes her, and he forgives her. Now, there are a lot of fascinating elements about this story. There are a lot of questions that rush into my mind as I think about this story, but let me just give you a few to consider very quickly. What is it about Jesus that drew people to him? There was something there. There was a charisma there that drew people to him. And what was it about Jesus that caused the regular, ordinary people of the streets, like you and me, or maybe even people like this woman, the outcast, so resonate with him? What was it about Jesus that attracted the masses to him? Why did they come from far and near just to get a glimpse of him? What was his authority? Why did lepers and blind people and sick people seek him out to see if they could just touch the hem of his garment? Why did the outcasts of society like this woman in Luke 7 feel wanted and welcomed and valued and included when he was there, and feel outcast when just the Pharisees were there? Those are all important questions for us to answer in 2022. Just as much as they were important in the first century. Well, I think there are many answers to my questions, but I want to just offer you 3 quick ideas for our consideration. Try these 3 on for size, because I think they tell us a little bit about how to love other people. I think outcasts listened to Jesus because he brought them good news. You see, the fact is, people then and now were starving for some good news. Religion for many of them back then had become cold and staid and authoritarian and negative and prohibitive and irrelevant and fearsome and sometimes even abusive. Sometimes it has done that to people today too. And people desperately needed good news. Listen to me, my brothers and sisters. Today is no different. We live in perilous times. We live in times of bad news. We live in times of hostility and division, unlike any we have seen at least since the 1960s, maybe unlike any of us have ever seen. Now, what is our message as Christians to a world like that? Does our message come across as bad news? As reclusive rather than inclusive? Because if it does, we have nothing to offer a sin-sick world. But if our message comes across as the saving gospel and the good news of our Lord Jesus Christ, I believe people who are hurting will listen today in 2022 just as much as they did in the first century. People being people. The religion of their time didn't speak to their hurts. It didn't bring them any joy. That's why they were so drawn to Jesus, because he did. Because he brought them good news. The word gospel literally means good news. And over again, he said to them, you count, you matter. It doesn't matter if the world doesn't see that, I see that. You are created in the image of God. You are valuable, and you're going to see that you are so valuable that ultimately I am going to purposely and deliberately give up my sinless life for you in a sacrifice on the cross. Let me make a point with a parable once made by the great old-time preacher Fred Craddock. One evening, a farmer named John was heading for home, running late, and tried to take a shortcut, cutting across an unfamiliar field, and he fell into an old abandoned cistern, a deep, deep, dark hole. John was a proud man, a strong man. He was a self-reliant man, so he said, I can get out of here on my own. And he made every effort he possibly could, but he was knee-deep in mud and sand. And as he reached the sides of the cistern, he had no leverage, and he would just keep slipping and falling, and he couldn't get out. And he finally swallowed his pride, and he began screaming, help, help, help. A neighbor walking by heard him cry and looked down in there and said, John, is that you? I can't believe you're down here. Look at you down there in that ugly hole. What an embarrassment you are to your family. What an embarrassment you are to yourself. Why did you get down in that hole? You're a disgrace. And the neighbor really told him off, and then he went into town and told everybody else about how he had told John off. And he said, I've been wanting to say that to that guy for years. He's an old, proud, self-reliant cuss. And it was quite a speech the neighbor gave to the town, but John was still in the hole, continuing to cry out for help, more desperately now. Next, a couple of politicians came by. And they saw John down in the hole, and they were upset, and they said, this is awful. This should have been taken care of years ago. So the politicians went into town and got the city council together and passed a law. And they came out and put up a sign that said $25 fine if you fall in this hole. And they said it was a good law. It needed to be passed. But John, he was still in the hole. And he cried louder and louder, help, help, help. And some people driving by heard him, and they came over to the hole and they said, this is a disgrace to our community. So they notified the beautification committee and the homeowners association. And they came out and they planted some azaleas and dogwoods and yellow roses and made the area around the hole beautiful. Because after all, if you're going to spend the rest of your life in a hole, doesn't it at least need to look attractive? And it was beautiful indeed, but John was still in the hole. Now with a raspy voice and almost no hope or voice left, he cried out once again, please, please, somebody help me. And a hand reached down and said, let me help you. I can get you out. Take hold of my hand, and in that moment, the only thing important in the whole world was that hand. The only thing in the whole world that could fix John's ultimate plight was that hand. Do you know who that was? Do you know whose hand it was that pulled John out of that hole? Some of you do. Some of you know real well, because you remember how he reached down and pulled you out of some hole sometime and saved you when nobody else could or would. And that, my friends, is the gospel of the good news of Jesus Christ. And people, even outcasts, were attracted to Jesus because they realized he was willing to pull them out of the hole. He brought them good news. But I think outcasts often listened to Jesus too because he practiced exactly what he preached. In Mark chapter 12, for instance, when Jesus talked about hypocrisy, he exposed it straight on. Beware of these teachers of religious law, for they like to parade around in flowing robes and receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces, and how they love the seats of honor in the synagogues and the head table at banquets, yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property, and then pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. Because of this, they will be most severely punished. The people were drawn to Jesus because they were fed up with hypocrisy, and he was no hypocrite. Whatever else you could say about Jesus, he was no hypocrite. He meant what he said. He practiced what he preached. He saw faith as a way of living. He was authentic and genuine, and the people sensed that and felt it and knew it. And so they were drawn to him. Over the years, I have mentioned to you 3 or 4 people that were particular mentors in my life that were very important to me. The third one, the one I've mentioned a little less than the other 2, was a man named Ken Redmond. He was the football coach in my home congregation, just a wonderful man. Won several state championships in Nashville, taught my Wednesday night Bible class. Can't tell you how many times the man walked off a football field and got right in his car and came in his cleats into Wednesday night teenage class and taught it. Just a wonderful guy. Died in his 90s about 2 or 3 years ago. And just a wonderful man and such an influence on me. So I've told you about him many times, but who I've never told you about is another guy. Very similar to him. In fact, for a while, coached at the same school. He also was a member of my home congregation. I will not say his name because the name may be well enough known that some people would know it. Because he was also a highly successful football coach. Very similar to Coach Redmond. And he was coaching at a local high school in a city championship game against Father Ryan. And my dad took me to the game, and I was about 11 or 12 years old. And after the game was over, this coach that I knew as a Bible teacher and somebody who led communion at church and a leader, and after the game, man, he just went into a profane tirade. And he threw something, and he was so angry, and you would have not heard profanity down at the dock with the sailors like he was doing. And then it's almost like a Jesus moment and Peter moment where Peter looked over and the cock crowed, remember? And then he glanced over and he saw me standing along the fence. And he stopped. He just stopped. Now, I guess there's a part of me that is glad he stopped, but it's also the definition of hypocrisy. I have a lot more respect for a person who uses profanity all the time, no matter what the setting is, than I do somebody who will stop when somebody walks up that they think it might offend. Because that's hypocrisy. You are who you are. You not are who you are just when certain people are around. And it damaged my impression of that man, literally for the rest of his life. Maybe it shouldn't have. Maybe he had a bad night, although they won the game. Maybe he had a bad night. I don't know. But I just felt in my little tiny heart of hearts so sad, so let down. Because deep down, we all want people to practice what they preach. We all deep down want people to be on Monday through Saturday who they look and say they are on Sunday. And I think the outcasts were drawn to Jesus because he was. He brought them good news, but he also practiced exactly what he preached all the time. Not just when somebody was looking. And one last reason, and this may be the biggest of all, that I think outcasts were drawn to Jesus is because to him they were not outcasts. To him they were not unclean. To him they were not untouchable. To him they were special. They were an eternal soul, created in the very image of God himself. Each was unique. Each was valued. Each was treasured. Each was to be loved. Each was to be respected. He didn't see them like Simon the Pharisee saw that woman as second rate. He didn't shun them as outcasts beneath him somehow. He didn't abuse them or exploit them like the tax cheats did that we read about in Mark chapter 12, the tax collectors. He didn't ignore them. He didn't look down his nose at them. And I think that's why the regular folk, the people of the streets, the masses, the sick, the lonely, the outcast, responded to Jesus and connected with him. Because to him, they were not lowly, they were not common, they were special, they were valuable. They were not outcasts, they were people who needed to be incasts. That's the way that he viewed them. They were not people to be despised. They were people to be loved and accepted and cherished and cared for. And as Christians, that's what he wants us to do. That's who he wants us to be. I'll end with a story I've always just loved. It's an old story about a woman in Birmingham, Alabama, many years ago, who walked out of a major department store in a snowstorm and temperature in the 20s. And she saw a little boy about 7 or 8 years old who was poorly dressed. He did not have a coat on. He was shivering. He also did not have shoes, and so he was literally trying to warm his feet at the vents that were coming out of the heat on the street. And she said, "Son, do you not have any shoes?" And he said, "No, ma'am, I don't." And she said, You come with me right now." And she took that little homeless boy back in that same department store and bought him a nice coat and some pants and some shoes and some socks and gloves. And he was so proud of them. And he thanked her so profusely. And then she went and put him in her car and took him to a shelter where she called a lawyer about care for him and made sure that he was in a safe and secure place for the night. And as she was leaving him, he said, "Lady, are you God's wife?" And she was embarrassed at the question at first. But then she said, "No, son, I'm not God's wife. But I am one of his children." And the little boy grinned and said, "I knew it. I just knew it. I just knew you were kin to him somehow." Can people tell you're akin to him somehow? Here's the way they'll know. Jesus said to his disciples, "So I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. And your love for one another will prove to the world that you're my disciples." All of us have a choice. We can live our lives more like Simon the Pharisee, concerning ourselves with making sure that we get all the little intricacies of our church and our religion down just right. And that we offer that only one cup of love that we've got to offer, which is you believe as I believe, do as I do, say as I say, dress as I dress, eat as I eat, think as I think, and then I'll let you be a part of me. Or we can be like Jesus. "By this shall all men know you are my disciples, if you love one another as I have loved you, so you must also love one another." And I'm convinced of this, that if we live like Jesus lived and love like Jesus loved, outcasts today will still want to be forgiven insiders.